Here is your story, told softly, just for you. The 999-year-old last wolf of the frozen mountains. A prince's hidden destiny. There is a kind of cold that is not unkind. It is the cold of very high places, where the air has grown thin and clean, and the world below has become something theoretical, a rumor of green fields and warm hearths that you half remember the way you half remember a dream by midday. This cold does not bite. It simply settles, the way certainty settles, pressing gently against the face and the hands and the chest until you understand quietly and without argument that you are somewhere beyond the ordinary reach of things. The frozen mountains of the north have this cold. They have had it for longer than anyone has kept records, longer than the oldest songs, longer than the first word anyone ever spoke about them, which was, in most languages, simply a sound of awe with no translation. The mountains were called the Vareth. Nobody remembered who had named them first, or why, or whether it had meant anything. They rose from the northern edge of the known world, the way a thought rises sometimes in the middle of sleep. Abrupt, enormous, impossible to look away from. Their peaks were white, their slopes were white. The pine forests that clung to their lower reaches were dark green in summer and buried in white in winter, and winter in the Varath lasted 8 months of the year. The rivers that ran down from them were iron cold and perfectly clear, and the stones on their beds were visible at great depths, as though the water were made not of water, but of glass ground fine. Nothing lived in the highest reaches of the Varath, nothing except one thing. His name, in the oldest language, meant something close to the one who remains. The people of the Valley Kingdoms had other names for him, most of them spoken quietly with a particular tone that sat between reverence and unease. Children were told stories about him that their parents half believed. Scholars wrote of him in careful, hedging language. Priests disagreed about whether he was sacred or simply very, very old. What was agreed upon across every tradition that touched on the subject was this. He was the last of his kind, he had lived for 999 years, and he still walked the high ridges of the Varath when the winter storms permitted. A shape of pale gray moving against the white, visible sometimes from the valley far below, and then not visible, as though the mountain had simply taken him back. His coat had been white once when he was young. Young was 900 years ago. Now it was the color of old ice, gray and white and in certain lights, faintly blue, as though the cold had worked its way into him so thoroughly that it had changed the color of things. He was large in the way that animals become large when they have been alive long enough, not through any single feature but through a quality of presence, a gravity, as though the air around him had more weight than the air elsewhere. His eyes were pale gold, the color of winter sunlight arriving at a low angle through bare trees, and they held within them the accumulated stillness of 10 centuries. He had watched the mountains change. He had watched glaciers advance and recede like slow thoughts. He had watched the forest below fill with human settlements and empty again, fill and empty, the way a tide moves against a shore that cannot be permanently claimed. He had watched his own kind disappear one by one over 400 years until he was the only one left. He did not think of this often. He had learned in the long centuries that there are griefs too large to look at directly, and that the only way to carry them is sideways, to feel their weight without facing them, the way you might carry something very heavy balanced on your shoulder, looking straight ahead, trusting your body to hold it. He carried it this way. He kept walking. He watched the stars from the high ridges with his old pale eyes, and he let the cold settle into him each night, and each morning he rose and walked again, and the mountains bore him on their ancient back, and neither of them spoke of what had been lost. His name was Sail. He remembered the woman who had named him. She had been the only human being he had ever loved without reservation, and she had been gone for 830 years, and the mountains still sometimes, in certain winds, seemed to carry a sound that reminded him of her voice, and on those days he would stop walking and simply stand, with his head slightly bowed until the wind changed. The prince's name was Corvin, and he arrived in the foothills of the Varath in the deep dark of a midwinter night, alone, on a horse that had given everything it had and could give no more. He was 17 years old. He had been riding for 4 days without adequate sleep, through a cold that had grown incrementally more serious with every hour, and he was wearing clothes that had been adequate for a palace in autumn, and were not adequate for the northern wilderness in the heart of winter. He had a knife, a half-empty saddlebag of provisions, a wool blanket that was damp through, and a letter bearing the royal seal of a kingdom he was no longer permitted to enter. He did not read the letter again. He had read it 7 times in the first day, and had understood it fully on the first reading, but something in him had kept returning to it the way a tongue returns to a wound, not to understand it better, but simply because the ache demanded acknowledgement. His father had been clear. The word exile had appeared twice, both times in his father's own handwriting, precise and final, in the dark ink his father used for documents of consequence. Corvin tied his horse to a pine tree at the edge of the forest, covered her with his blanket, and curled himself against her side for warmth, and he slept. He dreamed of fire, and of a voice speaking in a language he didn't know but understood perfectly, the way dreams grant impossible fluency. The voice was deep and slow and patient, and it said, "You have been coming here for 17 years. You simply took a long way round." He woke to snow falling. His horse was calm. The forest was silent in the particular way of forests under heavy snowfall. All edges softened, all sounds absorbed before they could travel. The world reduced to what was immediately, intimately present. Corvin sat up slowly and looked around and felt, despite everything, despite the exile, the cold, the damp, the fear that lived just below his sternum like a small animal that wouldn't settle, felt something unexpected. He felt, for the first time in a very long time, completely still inside. He did not understand this feeling. He filed it away, rose stiffly, fed his horse from the saddlebag, and began to walk upward into the Varath. He had no clear reason for going up rather than staying low. He told himself, when he thought about it at all, that there might be shelter higher up, some shepherd's structure or abandoned way station. But the truth, which he sensed rather than thought, was that the upward direction simply felt correct in a way that had nothing to do with logic. It was the way certain decisions feel when they arise from somewhere deeper than deliberation. He walked up through the snow-heavy pines with his hands tucked under his arms and his breath making small clouds, and the mountain received him with that particular neutrality that vast things have, neither welcoming nor hostile, simply present, simply enormous, simply old. He climbed for most of the day. He saw the wolf first as a shape at the far edge of a broad windswept ridge, perhaps 300 yards ahead, a stillness within the general stillness of the mountain, distinct from it somehow, present in a way that landscape is not. Corvin stopped walking. He was not afraid, which surprised him faintly, the way the absence of an expected feeling surprises you. He stood and looked, and the shape did not move, and after a long moment he understood that it was looking back. He walked toward it. The wolf watched him come without retreating, without any visible change of posture. As Corvin drew closer, the scale of the animal resolved itself slowly, the way distant things do, first an outline, then a shape, then a presence, then something that occupied your perception so completely that it was difficult to remember what you had been thinking about before you saw it. He stopped about 20 feet away, his boots deep in the snow, the cold sharp against his face and hands. The wolf's pale gold eyes met his, and Corvin felt something happen that he would spend a long time trying to describe afterward, and never quite manage. A sensation of recognition so complete and so ancient that it seemed to bypass him entirely, to occur somewhere beneath the level of personality, in some older layer of himself he hadn't known was there. "You're real," he said. He heard his own voice with a kind of detachment, the way you hear yourself speak in very quiet places. The wolf was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was exactly as it had been in the dream, deep and slow and patient, with a resonance that seemed to come not from his throat but from somewhere around him, from the snow and the stone and the cold air itself. "Everything real is real for longer than you know," he said. "You are cold." Corvin almost laughed. He was, in fact, extremely cold, and the observation was so matter-of-fact, so entirely free of any of the grandeur he might have expected from a 999-year-old wolf on a frozen mountain, that something in him relaxed entirely. "Yes," he said, "I've been cold for 4 days." "There is shelter," Sale said. "Come." He turned and walked, and Corvin followed. The shelter was a place where the mountain had folded in on itself, a wide ledge with a deep overhang of stone that blocked the wind on three sides, the rock face behind it still holding some vestigial warmth from a summer that had ended months ago. There were signs that this place had been used before, by things both animal and human, over a very long period of time. Old firestones, grooves in the rock where something had rested repeatedly, a sense of accumulated shelter, of the space having grown more habitable through long use. Corvin gathered what dry wood he could find at the forest edge below and made a fire with hands that had to be coaxed back into usefulness by the growing heat. And when the fire was established and the cold had retreated to a respectful distance, he sat cross-legged on the stone floor, and Sail settled nearby, a few feet from the fire, and they existed together in silence for a while, which felt entirely natural, as the most necessary silences do. After some time, Corvin said, "Why did you come to me? Or, I suppose, why did you let me come to you?" Sail looked at the fire. "Your name," he said. "Corvin. That is the name you were given. I mean the name you carry without knowing it." He paused. "What do you know about how your family came to rule the kingdom of Erin?" Corvin considered. He knew the official account, a story of valor and legitimacy that all the royal histories agreed upon, and that had always felt to him slightly too neat, the way stories that have been carefully managed feel slightly too neat. "I know what I was taught," he said. "Then I will tell you what I know," Sail said, "which is older." And he told him. He told him about a time before the kingdom of Arryn, when the land to the south of the Varath had been a wilderness of small settlements and river kingdoms that rose and fell with the seasons. He told him about a young woman who had come to these mountains not as a prince, and not in exile, but in grief, her entire village gone to a fever, herself the only survivor, 17 years old and entirely alone in the world. She had climbed the Varath because she could think of nothing else to do, and somewhere on the high ridges she had met a wolf who was, at that time, only 200 years old and still learning what his long life meant. He told it slowly, and Corvin listened, and the fire between them settled into coals, and was fed again and settled again. The woman's name had been Sable. She had stayed in the mountains through one winter, sheltered and fed and kept alive by a wolf who was still new to the weight of centuries and who had found in her company something he hadn't known he needed. She was fierce and funny and entirely unafraid of him in a way that had nothing to do with foolishness and everything to do with a particular kind of clarity. The clarity that comes when you have lost everything that fear normally uses to protect itself. They had talked through that winter the way people talk when ordinary constraints have fallen away, about everything, about nothing, about what it meant to be alive longer than made any sense. She had left in the spring. She had gone south and built something, not alone, but with the kind of purposeful gravity that belongs to people who have been remade by grief into something harder and more generous than they were before. She had built a settlement, then a town, then the foundation of what would become, 3 generations later, a kingdom. And she had carried something with her when she left, a stone from the high ridge, pale blue-gray, smooth-edged from the glacier, and a promise. "What promise?" Corvin said. "That when the line she carried ran into trouble that it could not answer alone, when one of her blood stood at the edge of what they knew and needed to understand what they came from, they would find their way here." He paused. The fire was very low now. "You are the 7th, he said. "In 900 years, the 7th to come." Corvin sat with this. He sat with it for a long time, feeling it settle into him the way the cold had settled, thoroughly into every part of him, changing the temperature of things. He was not the accidental exile he had believed himself to be for 4 days of cold and fear and loneliness. He was the latest movement in something 900 years old, a pattern so large it had been invisible from within it. "What happened to the others?" he said. "The other 6. "They went back," Sael said simply. "Changed. Ready. Your grandmother's grandmother was the 4th. She came at 16, younger than you, and she went back and ruled for 50 years and was considered by everyone who knew her to be the wisest ruler Erin had ever produced." He looked at Corvin steadily. "She told me I would see you. She was very precise about it. She described your eyes." Corvin said nothing. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment and breathed. The fire was nearly out. The cold was gentle, held at bay by the stone and the overhang and the enormous warm presence of the wolf beside him. "And you?" he said finally, lowering his hands. "What do you get from this? From keeping faith with a promise made 900 years ago?" The wolf was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was softer than it had been, not smaller, but nearer. The way sound is nearer in quiet places. "Company," he said, "and the reminder that what you love does not entirely disappear. It changes shape. It becomes something that carries forward." He looked at Corvin. "Your ancestor named me in her own language. She was the only person who ever gave me a name that felt like mine. Every time one of her line comes here, I am reminded that she was real, that the winter we spent talking about everything and nothing actually happened." He paused. "For something that has lived as long as I have, the reality of the past is not always certain. You help me be certain." Corvin built the fire back up. He was not sleepy exactly, but the specific exhaustion of the last 4 days had transformed into something softer. The tiredness of a body that has finally understood it is safe. He lay down on the stone floor with his pack under his head and looked up at the underside of the overhang, where the firelight moved in slow shapes. "Will you stay?" he said. He meant while he slept, but he thought they both understood it was a larger question. "I will be here when you wake," Sale said. "That is what I can offer." "That's enough," Corvin said. He slept. Outside, the snow fell with the steady, windless patience of mountain winters, each flake placed with apparent deliberateness, building the silence up layer by layer into something almost architectural. The peaks of the Varath rose into the darkness above, as they had for 10,000 years, as they would for 10,000 more, indifferent to dynasties and exiles and the small, warm insistences of human lives. Sale sat by the dying and rebuilding fire and watched the boy sleep. He looked, in sleep, younger than his 17 years, face smoothed out, the worry gone, breathing deeply and slowly the way people breathe when they have finally let something down. Sale had watched 6 of his ancestors sleep in this same hollow in the mountain. He had watched each of them wake, changed, and go back to the world below and do what they had come here to understand they were capable of doing. He did not know what would become of this one. He never knew. That was the nature of watching something that moved. You could see where it had been, you could feel the shape of where it was going, but the destination was always withheld from you, always just beyond the visible horizon, and that was, Sale had come to understand, entirely correct. Some things should not be known in advance. Some journeys require the full weight of uncertainty to be worth making. He looked out at the snow falling softly past the overhang's edge. Somewhere below in the dark, a pine tree shifted under the weight of accumulating snow, releasing a small, soft sound, and then was still. He thought of Sable, the way he did on some nights, not with the sharp edge of old grief, but with the quieter feeling that comes when something lost has been, in some partial and imperfect but genuine way, returned. She had been fierce and funny and entirely unafraid. This boy, he thought, was something like that. Beneath the exhaustion and the exile and the careful composure, there was something in him that had not been frightened into smallness, something that remained. The fire burned low again and was left to burn. The mountains held their cold and their silence and their enormous, patient presence around the small shelter, the way they had held everything that had ever found its way to them, without preference, without judgment, simply containing, simply enduring, simply being what they had always been. The oldest thing visible from the world below, the edge where the known gives way to the enormous, the place where a person could come to the end of what they thought they knew and find, waiting there, something far older and far less afraid. By morning the snow had stopped. The sky above the Varath was a pale, clear blue, the particular blue of high altitude in winter, not the warm blue of a summer sky, but something cooler and more precise, as though the atmosphere itself had been refined by cold into greater clarity. The peaks caught the early light and threw it back without warmth but with great brightness, and the whole range gleamed, and down in the valley kingdoms far below, people who looked north and happened to look at the right moment might have noticed, on the highest ridge, a shape of pale gray moving slowly against the white, and beside it, a smaller shape, keeping pace. Rest now. The mountains are patient. The snow is falling somewhere quiet. Whatever you are carrying tonight, whatever letter, whatever exile, whatever grief you have read too many times, The cold that is not unkind is settling over it, softening its edges, making it possible to carry a little longer. Sleep, the way the wolf sleeps, one eye on the fire, one ear on the wind, and somewhere deep inside, completely still.